The night my husband of 31 years walked into the anniversary party I had spent 3 months planning, with another woman on his arm. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I smoothed the front of my dress, picked up my champagne glass, and smiled at our guests like nothing in the world was wrong. That smile cost me everything I had left. But what happened next? That part didn't cost me a thing. I need to back up, because if I start at that moment, that awful, clarifying moment in the doorway of the Harrington room at the Bellwood Inn, you won't understand why I was ready. You won't understand why, for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't the one who fell apart. My name is Ruth. I'm 63 years old. I taught high school English for 28 years in Claremont, Georgia, and I know something about stories, how they begin, how they build, and how, if you're patient enough, they end. This is mine. I married my husband, Victor Aldridge, in June of 1993. I was 32 years old, already considered late by my mother's standards, and Victor was 35. Handsome in a quiet, serious way, the kind of man who held doors open without thinking about it, and remembered your coffee order after the first time you told him. He was a civil engineer. He built bridges for a living. I used to think that meant something about who he was as a person. We had 2 children. My son, Caleb, who is now 28 and works in IT in Atlanta, and my daughter, Monica, 25, who at the time of the events I'm about to tell you, was finishing her 2nd year of nursing school in Savannah. For most of our marriage, I would have told you we were solid. Not perfect. No marriage is, but solid. We disagreed about money, about how much time Victor spent traveling for work, about whether to put his mother in assisted living when her memory started going. But we worked through things. Or I thought we did. I now understand that I was doing most of the working. The signs were there. I know that now with the clarity that only comes after the fact, when you're sitting in a quiet house with a cup of tea gone cold, and you finally let yourself see what you spent years looking away from. The longer business trips. The new cologne I didn't recognize. The way he started closing his laptop when I walked into the room, casually, like it was nothing. Like he wasn't doing anything he needed to hide. I told myself, he's tired, he's stressed, he's going through something and he'll come back to me when he's ready. That's what you tell yourself after 30 years. You've built a life with someone. You don't just decide the foundation is cracked because you feel a draft. But in February of last year, I found out the truth. His name, the name I'd been seeing flash across his phone for months. The contact saved under the innocuous label, D. Warren Project Consult, was not a project consultant. Her name was Diana. She was 41 years old. She worked at the county planning office. And she and my husband had been seeing each other for nearly 4 years. 4 years. Caleb was 24 when it started. Monica was 21. I was 58 years old. And somewhere in the middle of driving to school board meetings and grading papers and planning Christmas dinners and sitting with Victor's mother on Sunday afternoons so she wouldn't be alone, my husband had fallen in love with someone else and decided not to tell me. I found out the way a lot of women my age find out, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through something small and stupid. A receipt in his jacket pocket when I was taking his dry cleaning in. A hotel in Macon. A date night I didn't know about. I stood in our laundry room for a long time, that receipt in my hand, and I thought about all the ways I could be wrong. I wasn't wrong. I didn't confront Victor that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't scream, didn't demand answers, didn't throw anything. I put the receipt back in his jacket pocket, hung his suits up in the closet, and I sat with what I knew for 3 weeks before I did a single thing about it. I called my friend Beverly, not Beverly Holt. A different Beverly entirely. Beverly Marsh, who I have known since we were both 22 and student teaching together. Beverly is the kind of woman who listens before she speaks. And she listened to me for a long time that night, before she said anything at all. Then she said, "Ruth, what do you want to do? Not what should you do? Not what are you going to do? What do you want to do?" That question changed everything, because I sat with it, and I thought about it, and what I realized was this. I didn't want to burn my house down in a rage. I didn't want to have a screaming match in my kitchen. I didn't want Victor to know that I knew. Not yet. Because the moment he knew, he would control the narrative. He would be sorry, or defensive, or both. And I would spend all my energy managing his reaction instead of protecting myself. So instead, I made an appointment with an attorney. Her name was Patricia Enfield, and she came recommended by my colleague Dora Simmons, whose own divorce, 15 years ago, had been handled with what Dora called surgical precision. Patricia had an office on Magnolia Street, second floor, with a window that looked out over a parking lot. She was matter-of-fact and calm, and she laid out my options the way you'd explain a map to someone who needed to know all the routes before they chose one. I chose the one I could live with. For the next 4 months, I said nothing to Victor. I went to Patricia's office 6 times. I gathered documents, financial records, account statements, property assessments. Patricia told me what I needed, and I found it, quietly, over weekends when Victor was working or out, running errands, or doing whatever it was he actually did with his time. I opened my own bank account. I moved a portion of our joint savings into it, the amount Patricia specified. No more, no less, everything above board and documented. And then, in late summer, Victor came home one evening and announced that he wanted to plan something special for our anniversary. Our 31st anniversary. In October, I looked at him across the dinner table. This man I had shared a bed with for 3 decades. This man I had raised children with, and nursed through a shoulder surgery and driven to the airport at 5 in the morning more times than I could count. And I said, "That sounds lovely, Victor. What did you have in mind?" He said he was thinking a dinner party. Something nice. A private room somewhere, close friends and family, a chance to celebrate. He said it with a kind of warmth that I had not felt from him in years, and part of me, the part that is still human, still capable of grief, felt the weight of what that warmth meant coming from him now, at this particular moment. I said, "Let me plan it. You know I love to plan things." He said, "You sure?" I said, "Absolutely." And so I began to plan the party at which I intended to end our marriage. I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to think I was being theatrical. I wasn't. I didn't plan that evening as some kind of revenge fantasy. I planned it because it was practical. Because I had an attorney who had advised me that, in the state of Georgia, serving papers in a witnessed setting was legally sound, and left very little room for dispute. I planned it because I was 62 years old, and I had spent my entire adult life making myself small enough to fit into spaces that were never quite designed for me, and I was done doing that quietly in private where no one could see. I invited 31 people. Close friends. My sister Lorraine and her husband, a few of Victor's colleagues he genuinely liked. My children, Caleb and Monica, both confirmed they'd be there. My neighbor and dear friend of 14 years, Paulette Okafor, who knew nothing about what I was planning but who I knew, if things went sideways, would be exactly the kind of steady presence I needed in the room. I booked the Harrington room at the Bellwood Inn for the 2nd Saturday in October. I ordered flowers, white dahlias, which had been my wedding flower, and which I thought, in retrospect, was a fitting detail. I arranged a dinner menu and a small cake. I wore the emerald dress I'd bought in Charleston 2 summers ago and never had an occasion for. I told Patricia we were ready. The papers were prepared. They would be delivered to me in a sealed envelope held by Paulette, who at that point still didn't know what was inside. I told her only that there was an envelope I might need her to pass to me during the evening. And Paulette, who knows me better than almost anyone alive, said, "Ruth, are you okay?" And I said, "I will be." And she held my hand for a moment and didn't ask anything else. The evening of October 14th was a cool Saturday in Georgia. The kind of October night that almost makes you forgive the summer, clear and dry with just a bite in the air. I arrived at the Bellwood Inn 45 minutes early. I checked the table settings. I adjusted 2 of the centerpieces. I spoke briefly with the event coordinator, a young woman named Tanya, who had been professional and kind throughout the whole planning process. I stood by the window for a moment and looked out at the parking lot and the dark tree line beyond it, and I thought, this is the last night of the life I've had. Tomorrow, whatever comes, will be different. I was not afraid. Our guests began arriving at 6:30. Lorraine was first, which was like her. My big sister has been chronologically first to arrive at every event I have ever hosted in my adult life, and I loved her for it that night more than I can say. She hugged me, held me a little longer than usual, and said, "You look beautiful, baby sister," I said. "Thank you, Lorraine." I did not tell her what was in the envelope. Victor's colleague, Stuart Beckett, and his wife arrived. My friend Linda Presswood came with her husband. Paulette arrived in a deep burgundy blazer, kissed my cheek, and pressed the envelope into my hands without a word, and I slipped it into the small clutch bag I was carrying. Caleb arrived at 6:50, alone. He lives 40 minutes away and had driven up that afternoon. He hugged me and said the room looked great, and I looked at my son. This young man I had nursed through ear infections and little league disappointments and a broken heart at 19, and I wondered, not for the first time in recent months, how much he knew. I had said nothing to either of my children. I'd made that decision deliberately, the same way I'd made every other decision in the past 4 months, carefully and with intention. Monica arrived at 7:05, breathless from the drive from Savannah, her dark hair still damp at the edges. She grabbed my hands and said, "Mama, I'm not late, the GPS lied." I laughed, really laughed, and it felt good. Victor was supposed to arrive at 7. He walked in at 7:12. He was not alone. I was standing by the far end of the table talking to Stuart's wife when I heard the shift in the room. That particular change in air that happens when something wrong enters a space. I turned, and there was Victor in the doorway in his gray suit, and beside him was a woman in a black dress, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, and she was looking around the room with an expression I can only describe as proprietary, like she was arriving at something she already felt she owned. Diana was tall, professionally dressed. She wore small pearl earrings. She was perfectly pleasant looking, in the way that made what was happening worse, not better, because there was nothing cartoonishly villainous about her, nothing that made it easy to understand how this had happened. How my husband had looked at this ordinary, put-together woman and decided she was worth destroying 31 years. The room went quiet. Not all at once, it rippled. Stuart noticed first, I think, and then Linda, and then I heard my sister Lorraine make a sound somewhere behind me that I can only describe as the sound of some choosing not to say what they are thinking. Victor's eyes found mine from across the room. Something moved through his face. Not shame, exactly. Something more like calculation, like he was gauging, in real time, what I was going to do. And then he smiled, and he walked her toward me. "Ruth," he said, "I want you to meet Diana. She's been a real support to me lately," and I thought, "Victor," I said. My voice surprised me. I had expected something thinner. What came out was my teacher voice, the one I used for 31 years when a classroom needed to be brought back from the edge of chaos. Calm, clear, final. I said, "I'm glad you're here. There's something I've been meaning to give you." I opened my clutch. I took out the envelope. I held it out to him. He looked at it the way people look at something they don't understand yet, but know they should be afraid of. "What is this?" he said. "It's a gift," I said. "Open it." He didn't move right away. Diana had gone very still beside him. I was aware of every person in that room. Of Lorraine's hand pressed to her mouth. Of Monica standing near the window looking at her father, like she was seeing him for the first time. Of Caleb with his set and his eyes on the floor. Of Paulette watching me from across the table with the steady, quiet attention of a woman who has known you for 14 years and would walk through fire beside you. Victor took the envelope. He opened it. The sound he made when he read the first page was not a word. It was something lower than a word, something involuntary. "Ruth," he said. "Ruth, this is, what are you? We need to talk about this, this is not." "The papers have been filed," I said. "Patricia Enfield's number is on the cover page. She's expecting your attorney's call." "You have an attorney?" He said it like I'd told him I'd grown wings. "I've had one since February," I said. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system. Victor looked at Diana. Diana looked at Victor. And then Diana did something I did not expect. She took a small step back, just one. But it was enough. In that one step, I saw something I had spent months wondering about. Whether she loved him, whether this had been real for her, whether she was under some illusion that she was the great love of my husband's life. And all she had to do was wait for the formalities to conclude. In that one step back, I understood. Maybe she did love him. And maybe she had just realized that loving a man who does this to his wife means you will always be standing in a room where people are looking at you the way they were looking at her right now. I don't know if I felt sorry for her. I've turned that question over many times since. I think what I felt was something beyond sorry. Something more like exhaustion, with the whole architecture of it, the whole arrangement that required one woman to be humiliated so another could feel chosen. I was done being part of that arrangement. I think, I said, looking around at my guests, at my sister and my children and my friends and the life I had built, that we should have dinner. I didn't plan this evening so we could stand in the doorway. Lorraine was the first one to move. She picked up her champagne glass, and she walked to my side and she stood there, close enough that our arms touched. Then Paulette. Then Linda. Then slowly, Stuart Beckett cleared his throat and moved toward the table. Victor stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he folded the papers back into the envelope. He said something to Diana in a low voice I couldn't hear. She nodded. And then they left. The door to the Harrington room closed behind them. I stood at the head of the table I had planned and arranged and decorated with white dahlias, and I looked at the people who had stayed, and I thought, this is what I have. This is what was always real. Shall we sit? I said. We sat. I need to tell you about Caleb and Monica, because I know some of you are wondering. I could see it in their faces that night, the shock, the confusion, the scramble to understand what they were supposed to feel. Caleb, who is like his father in certain structural ways I have spent years making peace with. Ordered, compartmentalized, reluctant to name things, sat very quietly through dinner and barely spoke. Monica cried once, briefly in the bathroom, and came back to the table and held my hand under the tablecloth for the rest of the meal without saying a word. Neither of them had known. I believe that. I need to believe it. And not only because it's easier, because when I look at my children, I see people who were also in their own ways deceived. But I also know that in the weeks that followed, Caleb called his father before he called me. I know that because Victor told me, in one of the few conversations we had through our attorneys, in a tone that suggested he thought it would hurt me. It did. I won't pretend otherwise. What I will tell you is that Monica drove up from Savannah 2 weekends later and helped me paint the living room a color I had been wanting for years. A deep, warm sage green that Victor had always vetoed because he preferred beige. We painted for 2 days and talked and cried and laughed and ordered takeout at 10 o'clock at night, and when it was done and we were sitting on the drop cloth-covered floor looking at the walls, Monica said, "Mama, it's beautiful." I said, "Yes, it really is." Caleb came around. It took longer. It has always taken Caleb longer to come around. But 3 months after that evening, he drove up on a Sunday without calling first, sat down at my kitchen table, and said, "I need you to know I'm not choosing sides," I said. "Caleb, this isn't about sides." He looked at me for a long time and then he said, "I know, I need you to know I see you, Mom." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, and we didn't talk about his father again that day. That was enough. That was more than enough. People have asked me, and they do ask, because something like this ripples through a community the way all significant things do, whether I regret doing it the way I did it. Whether a dinner party was the right place, whether I was performing, or punishing, or making a scene for an audience. I have thought about this carefully, the way I try to think carefully about things that matter. Here is what I know. I did not plan that evening to humiliate Victor. I planned it because I am 63 years old, and I have learned, at considerable cost, that the things we do in private, the concessions we make, the suffering we absorb behind closed doors, have a way of disappearing, of being revised, of becoming, in someone else's telling, something they did for our own good, something we misunderstood, something that wasn't as bad as we later claimed. I needed witnesses, not for drama, for truth. I needed the people who love me to see me standing up straight. I needed my children to see that their mother did not collapse. I needed to look into the eyes of my sister Lorraine, who has watched me make myself smaller in that marriage for decades, and let her see something different. I also needed to see it myself. There is something that happens when you act according to your own values openly, in front of the people you love. Something settles. Some long-held tension releases. I have tried to find the right word for it, and the closest I can get is integrity. The feeling of being, for the first time in a very long time, whole. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Patricia Enfield was, as Dora had promised, surgically precise. I stayed in the house. My choice, and one I made deliberately, because I was not going to let one more thing that was mine be taken from me. Victor moved into an apartment on the other side of Claremont. I don't know what happened with Diana. I found I didn't want to know. I went back to teaching for one final year. I had already been planning to retire, and I kept that plan. But I went back for that year on my own terms, knowing it was my choice, knowing I was choosing it rather than clinging to it, because I had nowhere else to be. There is a difference. It matters. I planted a garden this spring that I have been thinking about for years. Roses along the back fence, herbs along the side of the house, a small raised bed for tomatoes and peppers. Victor had always said gardening was too much work. I now know he meant it was too much work for him to tolerate watching me do something just for myself. On a Saturday in April, Paulette came over, and we planted for 4 hours, and then sat on my porch with sweet tea while the afternoon light came through the maple tree, and she said, "Ruth, how are you, really?" And I thought about it honestly before I answered the way she deserved. I said, "I think I'm good. I think I might actually be good." She smiled. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. I'm telling you this because I know some of you are sitting somewhere right now. Maybe in a kitchen, maybe in a car in a parking lot, maybe in a house that has felt less like a home for longer than you want to admit, and you are holding something you don't know what to do with. A feeling you've been talking yourself out of. A truth you keep setting down and walking away from because picking it up means everything changes. I am not going to tell you what to do. That is not my place, and honestly, it is not what you need. What you need is to know that it is possible to be 62 years old, or 55, or 70, and still choose yourself, still decide that the rest of your life belongs to you, still stand up straight in a room full of people who are watching and say, "This is where I draw the line." It is possible to be the age that the world calls old and feel, for the first time, like you are just beginning. I know because I did it. And because the morning after that October dinner, I woke up in my own house, in my own bed, and the autumn light was coming through the curtains, and the house was quiet, and I lay there for a while just breathing, and what I felt. Under the grief, which was real, and the exhaustion, which was real, and the uncertainty about everything that came next, what I felt, deeper than all of that, was free.